Hi, everyone. Welcome to the And God Said podcast. I'm Reverend Kimberly Constant, and this podcast is part of my 9-month Bible study called Cover to Cover, in which we read and study the Bible from Genesis all the way to Revelation. Today, we are looking at the portion of the book of Exodus that deals with the plagues and the events of the Exodus itself. Exodus chapter 7, verse 8, all the way to chapter 15, verse 21. And I've entitled this lecture, Plagues and Pilgrims. So let's talk about Pharaoh, because he features significantly in this part of the story. Some of this is a bit repetitive from my first lecture on Exodus, but bear with me to set the context for these plagues we're going to look at. So he, as we remember, was oppressing the Hebrew slaves. He was murdering their baby boys, telling the midwives to kill any of the infant boys that were born to Hebrew mothers. And if that's not enough, we remember that he also confronted God. And he said, "Who is this Lord? I don't know him." Those are fighting words when it comes to God. So what we're going to see in this segment of reading, that God responded. He answered Pharaoh in no uncertain terms. He certainly showed him who God is. And as we talked about in the last lecture, Pharaoh would seem to have a change of heart. We saw that in the reading. Sometimes, often a plague hits, and after a while, he's like, "Okay, God," or "Okay, Moses, I will let the people go. Just tell God to stop this plague." And it gets stopped, and things seem okay, and then he goes back to being a bad guy and says, "Nope, never mind. I'm not going to let the people go after all." So we learn that he's not genuine. His seeming to have a change of heart is never genuine. It's just a ruse, something in the moment, because he just wants his suffering to end. So the hardening of Pharaoh's heart, this is something I get asked about a lot. We see this language in the story where it seems as if God is hardening Pharaoh's heart. And you can rightly wonder, okay, what is going on here? Why would God do this? We understand God to be a God of love and grace and mercy, a God who gives chances often. So why would he, purposely do this to somebody? We have to look very closely at the language itself, at the Hebrew, and at the different forms of the verb that are being used. And when we do this, we find there are 3 different uses of this verb that means to harden. The first usage is talking about Pharaoh hardening his own heart. He's making his heart hard. I'm so sorry, my dog is barking every once in a while. He likes to sit by me when I record these podcasts, so everyone say hi to Bolt. He's making himself known. So Pharaoh will harden his own heart just by stubbornness, by meanness, vindictiveness, his own vile tendencies. Just over time, that's going to harden his heart. There's also language that talks about the passive tense, like Pharaoh's heart is hardened. Just a generalized description. It's not saying who's doing the hardening, just describing it as something that has been hardened. And then we have the third usage where indeed God is hardening Pharaoh's heart. Couple things to note about this. Number 1, God only hardens Pharaoh's heart after Pharaoh has already done it on his own. Pharaoh has hardened his own heart. He's already a bad guy. He's wicked and vile. He's given himself over to every evil inclination. And that's never going to change. And so God's going to take this process that Pharaoh has started, and he's going to use it. And he's going to add to it because he's going to use it for good. As we learned in the Joseph story, God will use bad things and turn them to good. So he's not hardening the heart of an innocent man. He's not hardening the heart of someone who might have repented at some point. God knows Pharaoh as he knows every single one of us. God knows Pharaoh's hearts as he knows every single one of our hearts. And God knows what the outcome of Pharaoh's part to play in this story is going to be. And so God can confidently and with not, without damaging his character. Being true to who he is, God can do the work of finalizing the hardening of Pharaoh's heart in order to use it for his good. So he's going to use Pharaoh's stubbornness. He's going to use Pharaoh's opposition to God for God's own purposes. He's going to bring good out of bad. And we will see God do this over and over again throughout the entirety of the Bible and throughout our own faith stories as well. So this leads us to the plagues themselves. There's 10 plagues. The first 9 can be divided into sets of 3. And those 3 sets are followed by the 10th and definitely the worst plague. So the first 3 plagues, water is turned into blood. We have the frogs, and we have mosquitoes and gnats. These are set into a group of 3 because everybody's affected. God's people, the Egyptians, anyone who's in the area are affected by this. In addition, the Egyptian magicians are able to recreate some of these plagues, but unlike Moses and Aaron, they can't put a stop to these plagues. Only Moses and Aaron can, because they, of course, have the true power, the power and the authority of God. Then the second set, we have flies, we have the cattle that die, and boils. In this set, God's people are not affected. So only the Egyptians are affected, or the people who refuse to be humble and follow God. As these plagues are going on, there are some Egyptians that are going, yeah, I believe in God, and they're moving over to the Hebrew camp. So when the people come out of Egypt, it's not just the descendants of Joseph who are emerging from Egypt and headed to the Mount Sinai. There's some Egyptians, there's probably some other people, foreigners that were in the land at the time. It's kind of a ragtag bunch of people. So as we see in this next group of plagues, God's people start to not be affected. So you can imagine that would be a draw, that you might be like, okay, I have boils, but the Hebrew people don't. You know what? I'm going to go with them. I'm going to give their God a chance because I don't want boils any longer. The next third set is hail, locusts, and darkness. So you can see in each set, things get progressively worse. Different areas are affected. By the time we get to the third set, it's like the sky, the dominion of the heavens is being affected by the plagues with the hail, the locusts, and the darkness. Once again, God's people are not affected, only the Egyptians or the people who were not following God. And then we have the final plague, which is the slaying of the firstborn. It's the events of the Passover, and God's people, again, are not affected by this plague. So each of the plagues contend with different aspects of Egyptian worship or their deities, their gods or goddesses. So remember, this all began with Pharaoh saying, I don't know this Lord. Who is he? Well, God's going to answer. And in each plague in which he answers Pharaoh, he's going to dismantle something that they believe in, some false thing that they worship. So the first plague, where the water turns to blood, is dismantling the authority of the Egyptian river deity. The second plague, about frogs, they worshipped the frog goddess Hecht, so that confronts her power and authority. Gnats and flies both confront things that were used in Egyptian worship. Then you have the livestock. This confronts the Egyptian god Hathor. The boils confront Imhotep. Hail, the goddess Nut. Locusts, the god Seth. Darkness, the god Ra. And then the final plague, the death of the firstborn, is contending with Pharaoh himself. Now, in Egypt, Pharaoh would have been worshipped as a god. He would have set himself up as being a supreme god. And if we remember, he's the one that issued the edict that the Hebrew baby boys would be murdered. So here, now he's going to get a taste of his own medicine, if you will. The punishment that he experiences is going to be the very same punishment that he decried for God's people. And so the firstborn baby boys in Egypt die in this final plague. So what do these plagues tell us about God? Well, they answer Pharaoh's question. Who is God? He is the God of the universe. He can control everything and anything. He can control nature. There is nothing that God cannot touch. There's no power that God does not have. So they tell us that God has power. They become a testimony to future generations. This isn't just something that is one and done affecting just these people in this time. This story is going to be told forever and ever. We're talking about it today in 2023. That's how the longevity of what God has done here. So it's a testimony to future generations. It's a difficult testimony though, right? I mean, there's violence here. The final plague is awful. The thought of those sweet baby boys dying. It's awful. It's awful. There's just no other way around that. But it's also a testimony to God's deliverance of his people. For all the awfulness of these plagues, God's people had endured the same awfulness for hundreds of years at the hands of Egypt. They had gone through all of the same things. It's a testimony to God hearing and seeing what's going on, to God punishing the wicked and evil people who refuse to turn to God and have faith, who continue to oppress and cause just great terror to the people of Israel. So, as awful as it is, in the weirdest way, it's also a story about hope and deliverance, and that God is there, and that God is a God of justice, and he will not allow injustices to go on forever and ever. These plagues tell us about God's judgment over these false gods, these demons, the false things that Egypt has worshipped. They serve as a warning to the nations. Here's God's people. They're marching on the way to the promised land. You better take care, because God can do anything. Look what he did to Egypt, because they were disobedient and because they refused to let the people go. Which brings another point about the violence. At any time, Pharaoh could have been like, yep, go. Moses, go. People, go. Like, I get it. God, you are God. I'm so sorry. I shouldn't have questioned who you are. I shouldn't have questioned your authority, and I should have just did what you wanted me to. And he never does that. He never does that. They have a lot of chances. And even if, okay, so let's say you're an Egyptian woman, you have no agency, you're at the whim of your husband, you're ruled over by Pharaoh. Let's say you get the boils and you look at the Hebrew people and you think, they don't have boils and I do. Like, I really want to go be a part of them. You could have gone and been a part of them. So that is the other point to remember. There was a way out of this. There was a way to escape this, the continued plagues, the punishments that they were experiencing. You could have gone to the Hebrew camp. And as we see, as I will say time and again, the people that emerged from Egypt were not just Hebrew. There were also Egyptians there. There were people from other ancient Near Eastern groups. Kind of anyone that saw what was going on and thought, yeah, that's a God I want to follow, because I believe that's the one true God. So it was possible to escape this. Number 6, the plagues tell us of God's greatness. They become a testimony to Israel itself. Look what God can do. Look what he did for us. This is how much God cares about us. God heard our cries. He saw our oppression. He realized that Pharaoh was trying to literally stamp out the nation of God's people, and he intervened. He did not allow the people to be wiped out. Remember the promise of the rainbow. God said, never again will I destroy all life. And here Pharaoh was just not destroying all life, but certainly destroying the life of God's people, and God stepped in. And finally, the plagues tell us about God's willingness to give a chance. He offers redemption. He allows for repentance. As I said, there are 10 plagues. At any point after any plague, people could have said, Uncle, I believe in you, God. I want to be a part of your people. I want to be spared from whatever's coming next. And they could have been. That's all it would have taken. Just saying, yep, I'm going to be with the Hebrew people. So he gave chances. The people that were around for the 10th and final plague, as awful as it is, are people who truly wanted to defy God in every possible way. So let's talk about the first Passover. This is the event of that final plague. In Jewish life, it is the beginning of their calendar. It occurs around the time of the Christian holiday Easter. It's very symbolic of Jesus. They have lamb, they sacrifice a lamb and they eat it. They put the blood of the lamb on the door frame of their house, and that's how the angel of God would know to pass over their house because of the blood. This points us forward to Jesus on the cross. He will be called the Lamb of God who takes away the sins of the world. He is sacrificed, he is put upon the cross, and it is his blood that allows us to have entrance into the eternal life, into forgiveness. It is the bridge that allows for redemption, for us to be seen as pure and holy. So lots of connections going on here. One of my professors said, faith needs something to see and to touch. Faith is about believing what we cannot see, but God is generous and kind, and he gives us things, physical things to cling to help us in our faith. And so for Israel, for the Jewish people, the celebration of the Passover becomes the central remembrance of their faith. It is something to see and touch. They gather together, they eat the lamb, they have all sorts of traditions that they follow now. And it reminds them of what God has done and what God will do for them again. We see this with the covenants. There's physical signs of remembrance, of connection. There's the rainbow for the covenant with Noah. There's circumcision for the Abrahamic covenant. We will see the tablets of law for the Mosaic covenant, which we're going to talk about in the next lecture when we talk about the formation of God's people by way of law. There will be actual physical tablets that they can see and touch that have God's law on them. And then God's going to have them celebrate other things. There'll be festivals and feasts. They're going to be taught this sacrificial system, things that kind of give bones, give physicality to their faith. So it's not all head and heart knowledge, although that's a huge part of it. But God gives us these things. And in the New Testament, we're going to see this in baptism and in the celebration of the Lord's Supper. These are going to be things that we do that allow us to have some physical connection to this faith we have in God. So the way out of Egypt, the quickest way was something called the way of the land of the Philistines. It was a northern coastal highway. But they didn't go this way because this was also where Egypt had its military base. If they had gone this way, if Moses had led the people out on this road, it would have taken them about 3 weeks to get to the land of Canaan. So much quicker than the path that they choose. There was also a way out in the east, but this was blocked as well by walls and towers and lakes and canals. Egypt had thoroughly blocked it. They had done everything they could to kind of make no escape possible. So the only way out was through. Another spiritual metaphor for us. They couldn't escape on the highway. There was no way out in the east. They had to go through the water and through the wilderness. And this is so true, isn't it, of our stories, of our faith relationship with God. Often we will go through times of wilderness or times where we feel like we are headed to a Red Sea with no discernible way to get through the water. And God brings us through it, not out of it. He walks with us in the storm. He walks with us in the wilderness. He doesn't necessarily remove our circumstances, the things that are making us feel so bad, but he walks with us and he brings us through it. And this is what he does for Moses and the Israelites. So the way they take is much longer, and it takes them about 3 months just to get to Mount Sinai. And it's a journey that takes them through a vast and harsh desert wilderness. And we're going to find that they don't handle that very well at all. And then even getting to Mount Sinai itself is not the most lush of places. So they're really in a tough wilderness for quite a while as God is forming them into his people. Lots of parallels there with Moses' own story. Remember, he was in the wilderness. And even with Jesus, he's going to spend some time in the wilderness before his ministry begins. And of course, with the rest of us, we all have our wilderness wanderings. So that brings us to the end of this portion of Exodus. And then next week, we're going to look at, or not next week, next lecture, sorry, we're going to look at them being formed into God's people. And we'll talk about the law, the covenant that God makes with Moses, as well as the tabernacle and the symbolism that that's going to play. God's going to have lots of different components to create a community out of this random group of people. There's Hebrews, there's Egyptians, there's other ancient Near Eastern peoples. It is a ragtag bunch. They don't all speak the language. They don't all look alike. They don't have the same backgrounds. They probably come from different classes of wealth. We are talking about a mixture of people, and God is going to unite them and make them his own. So that is up next. Thanks so much for listening, and I'll catch you for the next lecture.